This is lecture 7 of Logika or računalništvu, and having spent 3 lectures on propositional logic and 3 lectures on predicate logic, we are going to now again change logic and even change genre of logic. That's change the kind of logic we're looking at to a rather specific logic designed for certain kinds of applications, particularly in computer science. And the specific kind of logic is called a temporal logic. That's a logic where you reason about time. And we're going to look at one of the most famous temporal logics and most useful temporal logics, which is called linear time temporal logic, or LTL for short. So the linear time in temporal logic, why it's called linear time, is it means that it considers time as a linear order. So events in time happen in sequence. They're totally ordered. If you've got one event in time, it happens. If you've got 2 events in time, one of them happens before the other. That may seem a rather uncontroversial statement about time to you, but in computer science there are other logics of time, so known as branching time logics, that indeed have their uses, but they are a bit more complicated than the linear time logic we're going to look at. And as I've said, linear time logic is really one of the most useful logics in computer science. So for this course, we are just going to look at linear time logic as our example of a temporal logic. So, what's it good for, linear time temporal logic, or let's say LTL, to avoid the rather cumbersome phrase of if we call it by its full name. So it's particularly good for expressing properties of systems where we are looking at systems in which there are several different components acting simultaneously, so what are called concurrent systems. Such systems might be in software, so you might have several different software programs or clients or something all operating simultaneously, or it might be in hardware, where you might have several different chips on the same network, and of course they are all running simultaneously. It does not really matter what kind of system. LTL is a good logic, has proved itself to be a good logic for expressing properties of such concurrent systems, as they are called, irrespective of whether they are hardware or software. Okay, so we're going to talk about a logic that models systems. So in order to do that, we need some mathematical bridge between real-world systems like computer software systems or computer hardware systems and the logic. And that bridge is provided by a notion of model that is appropriate for modeling, a mathematical model that's appropriate for modeling concurrent systems. So this is something called a transition system, and let me tell you roughly what it is. So systems in general, hardware, software, what have you, but especially concurrent systems. So that's one in which components are acting concurrently with each other. Oh, I'm misspelling concurrent. Are often usefully modelled in a mathematical way. what are called transition systems. And in a transition system, we have two components, two different kinds of components. We have states. So states represent the state in which the entire system can be in. So states represent distinct states. We're using the word states twice here, but let me comment on that in a moment. Distinct states of the system being modelled. So the idea is we have some real-world system that we're modelling, and of course that system can be in many different states. And in our mathematical model, which is a transition system, we need to put in one mathematical state for every different real-world state the system can be in. And we're going to have transitions, and those are the transitions represents the possibility for moving from one state to another state. So transitions so these represent possible actual transitions. That means changing states between real-world states, say. But really, the basic idea, the basic idea is that you're modelling the system as a whole as its collection of states it can be in, and the possible transitions that it can take from one state to another state. And in addition to states and transitions, we might have a bit more information. We may have a number of basic properties that may hold at states. So we have states, transitions, and properties in general. And they hold at states. For example, this is just to illustrate the sort of thing we're talking about. It is an error state. Or something like flag 17, some piece of data is in this state, is set to true. Or in this particular state, something like the printer disky, it's the name of the printer in this case, is busy. And so on. These are just examples. So, etc. So maybe it's a good thing to start with is an actual example of a transition system that that means something. So we consider an example transition system for motivation. consider the following example. I'll just write trans.sys. So the example is going to be a model of an important property that protocols often need to implement, which is called mutual exclusion. And the idea here, so first I'm going to give the informal idea, and then we're going to model it mathematically as a transition system. So the idea is we're going to have, we're modeling a situation in which we have two parallel processes accessing a shared resource. There's a natural generalization to n parallel processes, but where n is some natural number, but we're just going to model the case for two processes. So we have two parallel processes. So the shared resource might be the printer, might be, for example, the printer, but it could be anything, or some memory. But the point is that the resource will only grant access to the processes one at a time. So we can't have both processes communicating with the same with the shared resource simultaneously. So different processes are not allowed simultaneous access. So we have a little bit of a protocol. So instead, processes follow the following protocol in order to communicate to the resource. So first, a process puts in, if a process wants to use a resource, it first puts in a request to use the resource. So a process puts in a request if it wants to access the resource. And it uses the resource only once that request is granted. The request is granted. And then when it's finished with the resource, it releases it so that other processes can use it, or the other process can potentially use it. In general, let me rewrite uses because that doesn't look very readable there. So it uses the resource only once the resource is granted, and then it releases once finished. Oh dear, once finished, not finite. Once finished, the resource is released. for other processes to use. Of course, we've only got one other process, but actually the same process might want it back, so it could also be the same process again. But in general, as I said at the start, one might have mutual exclusion for any number of parallel processes. Anyway, once the process is finished with the resource is released for other processes to use. Other processes to use. So to model this as a transition system, I'm going to draw the transition system as states are going to be given by bubbles that are going to be annotated with annotations that represent the properties of the states, and we're going to draw arrows which represent the transitions between the states. So I'm going to model this as a transition system. So maybe I'll just draw it first. We model this as a transition system, and then I'll write the notation at the bottom. So the transition system is going to have a start state. So we come into the start state, and every state is going to be labelled by two properties, and the properties represent so the state is the state of the whole system, and the properties represent the state of the two different processes. So we've got the two different processes competing for the resource, and at the start, when we come in, both processes are individually in the state which is known as non-critical, meaning they are doing their own thing quite happily, and in the current state, neither of them wants to use the shared resource. However, from such a state in which the processes are non-critical, either one, process 1, or the other, process 2, might decide to put in a request for the resource. So we're going to call that the process is trying for a resource. So if process 1 tries, then we'll go into a state that process 1 is trying and process 2 is still non-critical. So that's if process 1 tries first. If process 2 tries for a resource, so notice this transition system is what's called non-deterministic, in that from this state we might leave it in different directions depending on what happens in the real world, but we don't know what's going to happen in the real world. And indeed we may come back to this state many times and sometimes go in one direction, sometimes go in the other. So in the case that the second process tries for the resource, we go into the state N1 T2. It may be the case that both processes try for the resource, so we could have another arrow to a process T1 T2, or we may assume that no two processes ever do make an action absolutely simultaneously as each other. So if one process is going to act before the other, then if both processes are going to act, one of them must act before the other. So this is a modelling choice. Let's do it like this: that only one process can change at a time. It doesn't really matter one models in the way that's most appropriate to the situation that one is modelling in general. So anyway, these are the ways in which if we start off with two non-critical processes, we can get one of them trying for a resource, or the other trying for the resource, or indeed both of them trying for a resource. But once a process tries for a resource, then at some time after that, the resource may grant access to the process. And when the resource grants access to the process, that process is said to become critical. So that process is in the critical state that it's accessing the resource, and when that happens, the resource is blocked off from all other processes. So here T1 is trying for the resource, so it might become critical, in which case we get that. So process 1 is trying for the resource, so then process 1 becomes critical, and process 2 stays, in this case, non-critical. And the same way here, we've got that process 2 is trying for the resource, that might become critical, so process 1 stays non-critical and process 2 becomes critical. Here we've got two processes trying for the resource, so either one of them might become critical. So maybe process 1 will become critical. So then we go to critical 1, and then process 2 is still trying for the resource. Of course, it now cannot get access to the resource. Let me extend that arrow a bit to where it goes to. And or from here, maybe process 2 will get access to the resource. So in that case, process 1 is still trying and process 2 becomes critical. Actually, we can also get from this state to this state, because while process 1 is accessing the resource, it may be the case that process 2 will put in a request, and so it will start trying for the resource. And also here, while process 2 is accessing the resource, process 1 might put in a request. But in order to model mutual exclusion, what we don't give ourselves is we don't allow ourselves to move from either of these two states to one in which the request is granted to the state that's trying. So we are not going to have a state C1, C2 in the transition system, because the whole point is that only one process can be critical at any one time. So what can happen after a process has become critical? When it's finished being critical, well, then it will go back to being non-critical. So it's going to be released, and when this one is released, then so process 2 will still be trying, but process 1 will become non-critical. So we have a transition that takes us over here and back to there. And in a similar way, when this process that's being critical, when that's released, when the resource releases it, or it releases the resource, whichever way around you want to have it, then this process 2 becomes non-critical, but process 1 is still trying. So we go, it's a nice symmetric picture. We go all the way over there. And similarly here, when process 1 finishes with the resource, then it becomes non-critical, and process 2 is still non-critical, so here we go back to the beginning. And also here we go back to the beginning. Okay, so just to write down the annotation so it's in the notes. So N is the process is non-critical. Not accessing or trying to access, emphasis on not, or trying to access the resource. T is process is trying. These ditto marks, as we call them, mean that we're copying processes from above. So the process is trying to access the resource. I'm not writing the articles because I want to save myself too much writing on this awkward tablet. And finally, C is that the process is critical. So it is accessing. It is accessing the resource. So this is a nice little model of some meaningful system using a transition system. If you want to a little exercise, you could try and draw the corresponding transition system for 3 processes. Be warned, it has quite a lot of states. So anyway, you can think about that. It's not too many states to manage, but it's more states than we've got in that picture, obviously. So what LTL is going to allow us to do, so let's is that LTL will allow us to, when we've got a model like this, to state properties that may or may not hold of the model. And it will be sometimes useful to see whether or not those properties do hold in the model, because assuming that our model is a good model of the system, we might want to check that some properties we do want the system to satisfy hold in the model, and also that properties we don't want the system to satisfy do not hold in the model. Now, of course, that does rely on the model corresponding to reality. That's always a question with mathematical modelling of situations. You always want your model to correspond to reality. But the point of having some way of checking whether properties hold is that one can use this for properties that are really quite complicated, and it's not easy to check by hand, or it might even be impossible to check by hand because your transition system may have thousands or indeed millions of states. But nonetheless, some software can, as it turns out, check it for you. So we're going to, like in the previous 2 parts of the course on propositional logic and on predicate logic, we're going to gradually work our way from theory to practice by ending up with software that, by looking at software that actually uses this technology. But to begin with today, I'm going to keep the examples nice and simple like this, so we can understand them. And what I want to explain today is how LTL allows us to express properties of interest about such systems expressed as transition systems. So LTL allows us to express in a mathematical, logical language useful properties of transition systems. And the basic idea is to think of the actual evolution of a system, which will correspond to the way how the system computes in reality, which, because it's non-deterministic, may differ from one day to the next. We may run it one day and it may behave in a certain way. We may run it the next day and it may behave in a different way. But no matter what happens, the evolution of the system will correspond to a path along the arrows through the transition system. So we start off in N1, N2, and we might go this way and this way and this way, and then maybe we'll go back here and this way and this way, and then maybe we'll go back, well, then we have to go back here, and then this way, and then this way, and then this way, and then this way, and so on. So LTL is going to allow us to express properties of runs through the system. But in fact, even though in reality all runs will be finite, it turns out to be very useful to have the abstraction of expressing properties of infinite runs of the system, as we'll see. So LTL the basic idea of LTL, let's give you a bit more space, right, here we are. So the basic idea is to express properties of infinite runs. So in the above example, let's consider some properties of interest. So two properties of interest in the above example. So an important one is mutual exclusion itself. So let's do this as bullet pointed list. So mutual exclusion itself. And we can express this as the system is never in a state never in a state in which both process 1 and process 2 are critical simultaneously. Now this does not look very exciting, because when we look at our model, well, what we're saying is the system will never be in a state in which both C1 and C2 appear hold in the state. So we will never end up in a bubble in which C1, C2 holds. And that's obvious because there is simply no state in the system in which C1, C2 holds. We could add such a state. I mean, doesn't do anything for us because we never get to it. C1, C2, if we like. So now we've got it, but it's clear that we can't ever get to it by a transition starting from the starting state. So in this case, this is actually rather a trivial property. But for complex systems, quite often one does have states and that you do not want the system to be in, and you have to prove that there is no way of the system getting into the state. You really want to know the system will never get into that state. It's an undesirable state. And that amounts to some argument that you cannot reach the given state, the state that you're worried about, from say, the starting state of the system. And that involves a bit of for very large systems, that can involve a little bit of a complicated process because you need to check this reachability condition. I mean, this can be done using general graph algorithms. It doesn't require temporal logic, but the point is that the idea that one might need to express that there is a kind of state that we don't want to ever be in is quite an important property that one might express. It might be more complicated than it might be more complicated than this. It might not be there is a particular state that we don't want to be in, as in this case, but rather we do not want to ever get into a state that satisfies some particular worrying property, where that can be itself a worrying a property that's difficult to check for a state. So the point is, in this case, this is a simple example, but it's nonetheless illustrative of more complicated examples that can arise. So just to say, in LTL, we'll see later, but in LTL, this is formulated as G, or it's globally the case, or always in the future. So it's globally the case that it's not true that both C1 and C2. So C1 and C2 are properties that hold the state. If C1 holds, then process 1 is critical in that state. If C2 holds, process 2 is critical. And this says it's never the case globally, a longer run, along any run, it's never the case that it's not the case that both C1 and C2 hold. And I just want to, before moving off this rather simple property, before moving to the next one, I just want to mention some terminology. So this is an example of a kind of property that's rather useful in computer science, and so it has a name. So this, that's supposed to be a T. This is an example of what's called a safety property. And safety properties in general say so safety properties in general say the system avoids some specified kind of undesirable state. So safety because, for example, we avoid a crash with disastrous consequences. We avoid an unsafe state. Okay, so that's one example, and so just to write maybe in blue. So our model obviously satisfies mutual exclusion. Okay, so let's consider another property that we might consider the system to have. And this is going to be a property that instead of saying we avoid some specified kind of bad thing, it's a property that says actually we want the system to satisfy some specified kind of good thing, good property. So the second property, oops, maybe go back to black. So the second property is that if a process requests the resource, then eventually the request is satisfied. The request is granted, let's say. It is given, the process is given access to the resource. So if a request tries to get a resource, so process 1 here, then eventually we are guaranteed that the property is saying that if we try for a resource, so in this case process 1 is trying for the resource, then eventually process 1 will be granted the resource, so will become critical. But that isn't guaranteed by the model itself. So because once we try with process 1, then process 2 might try, and maybe process 2 will be given the preference, and then when it's released we go back to this state where again process 1 is still trying, but maybe process 2 is really pushy and asks and again requests for the resource, and maybe the resource or the scheduler or what have you is a bit biased and again grants access to process 2, and maybe we keep on going round this loop, and poor process 1 that put in its request at the beginning maybe isn't ever going to get granted the resource. So the point is the model itself does not guarantee that this happens. So our model does not guarantee this. So e.g. consider and consider the run. And to consider the run, maybe we need to give the states some labels. So we would often name the states. So this might be S0, S1. Let me make it consistent with my notes. S2, S3, S4. Don't know why I numbered them this way anyway, but S5, S6, S7, S8 if we like. And while we're here, I should say that even though there's no state, there are no transitions into this state, if we did have this state, we might imagine there might be transitions out. So for example, when C1 gets released, we would go to N1 C2. So there might be an arrow back from here to here and another one from here over to here. But anyway, let's not worry about that sort of thing. This is not really an interesting. This state here is not an interesting part of the model. The point is now with this notation to hand, we see that S0, S1, S3, S7 going back to S1, S3, S7, and that loop is a run that does not satisfy the condition that we wanted to hold, that whenever a resource is requested, then eventually it's granted. So the bad run here is S0, S1, S3, S7, and then we go back to S1, and this infinite run does not guarantee, so this is an infinite run that violates the fact that process 1 had requested the resource, but we can keep on going forever without process 1 ever getting granted the resource. So one sees from this that the idea of modelling executions as infinite runs is not such a bad idea, because we have using that we can model the fact that in this case, if the environment and the control over who gets access to resources set up badly, then but it could still conform to the model we have and satisfy the property that however long we wait for the run, the process 1 will not get granted the resource. So we need to use infinite runs in order to, or at least arbitrary length runs, but then it's natural to have the infinite run in order to talk about however long we wait. Okay, I wanted to make 2 other comments about this. The first one is how this is modelled in LTL. So in LTL, well, I haven't introduced the language of LTL, but it's good to be getting used to it by some examples. We're going to say that the property we want is that, so this property, if a process requests the resource, then eventually the request is granted, is that globally, so however far we look into the future, if it's the case that process 1 puts in a request, then eventually at some point in the future from where we currently are, at the point that the request was put in, then we want the process 1 to become critical. And in the same way, if process 2 puts in a request, then globally, then eventually at some point in the future, process 2 should become critical. So this is the point this is the property we want to satisfy. So globally at all points in time, if ever it happens that process 1 puts in a request, then eventually further in the future it will be granted that request, it will be granted access, and the same property for process 2. Okay, but as I say, our model does not guarantee that this property holds. And lastly on this, I want to say that this is an example of something called a liveness property. So this is an example of a so-called liveness property. So safety was we avoid something bad happening. Liveness is that something good eventually happens. Or maybe it is always the case that something good eventually happens. So the system is live, it's aiming towards a property, a desired property that we want to hold in the future, and we will actually get there. Only this system is potentially does not satisfy liveness because this property does not hold. But anyway, it's a liveness property because it's saying that so the something good that we want to happen is that that we want to eventually happen is that when a request is put in, eventually the request will be granted. Right, okay, so that's the motivational part. What I propose to do is give a little bit of the mathematical definitions now. What I'm going to do is define the notion, give a mathematically rigorous definition of the notion of transition system that we're going to use. Having done that, that will be a good point to pause the lecture and have our lecture break, and then we can look at LTL itself in earnest after the lecture break. So let's give the definition of a transition system. Having seen an example, it's now not so hard to understand the definition. Now, in computer science, transition systems are quite important and arise in many different areas, and basically the idea is roughly the same. You always have states and you always have transitions, and they're used for modeling systems, but depending on exactly the context, the definition might change. So this particular definition is one good definition of transition system, but it's particularly tailored to using the definition to model the linear time temporal logic LTL. So this is a definition of transition system for LTL. And if one's looking at transition systems for some other purpose, then one may find slightly different definitions. Okay, so a transition system we'll underline it because that's what we're defining. So a transition system is a mathematical structure. I'm again going to use a curly M for it because it's going to play a similar role to the role that our structures or models, as we called them, played in the lectures on predicate logic. So in general, I'll use curly M for structures that are models. With transition systems, they're very naturally considered as models because they are models of real-world systems. That's what we're thinking of them as. So the transition system is given by three components. S, arrow, and L. So S is simply a set. It's always going to be finite. So let me put that in brackets. A finite set, but the mathematical notion makes sense also if it's not finite. And it's a finite set Actually, let's remove the finite condition. Often in the real world, we're going to be modeling finite state systems, so it usually will be finite, but there's no need to put it in the mathematical definition. So S is a set of, well, it's just a set. Mathematically, it's just a set, but we're going to call the elements of the set states. So the brackets means we're not giving additional information. S is just a set, but I'm just saying that states is what we call the things. So arrows is a binary relation. On the set S. So in other words, equivalently, this means equivalently, arrows, you can think of it as a subset of S, of the product set of S with itself. So the arrows is a subset of set of pairs of states, but we'll just think of it a binary relation, and it needs to satisfy a certain property. So we're going to ask for it to satisfy that from any state there exists another state such that we can get from the first state to the second state. So I'm going to comment on that in a moment. Let's call this property star. And thirdly, we have L is what we call a labeling function. And this maps every state, so it maps the set of states to the power set of a set of propositional atoms. So what that means, so the power set is the set of, we have some set of propositional atoms. Those are the things like T1 and T2 and C2 and so on. These are stating properties that may or may not hold of states. And the power set of atoms is the set of all sets of atoms. And so here we're saying that L is a labeling function that maps a state to a set of atoms. So let's write that down. So i.e. L assigns to each state little s belonging to the set big S a subset the atoms of state little, should make it clear this is a little s, so that's a set of atoms. So you view that as the set of all atoms that we think of as being true at that state. So I suppose the only thing I'm missing out of here is that, of course, we call this the transition relation. So again, let's put that in brackets because it's just what we're calling it. So this is the transition relation. And possibly one state is identified as a start state. So I'll put that in brackets. That can be part of the definition. It doesn't always need to be part of the definition. Okay, so let's look at our example earlier. So this is our transition system. So the states are the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 are the sorry, what are there 8? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yes, there are indeed. Are these 8 bubbles together, if you like, with this one? The labeling function, so the label of S0 will assign it N1, N2. So our atoms here are, let me put that in brackets. So our set of atoms here is N1, N2, T1, T2, C1, C2, and the set that every state is labelled with is written in its bubble. Well, the transition relation, well, we've got this state here. At the moment, we have the condition that every state needs to have an arrow out of it to some other state. You can't get stuck in a state. That's what that condition says. So in fact, as I already commented, if we do have this state, we should really put an arrow from here to here. What if we're releasing process one, and if process one is releasing the resource, and an arrow from here to here if process two is releasing the resource. So I could draw those in, but I don't want to make the picture more complicated. So actually, I'm just going to remove this state because it's not really playing any interesting role in the model. I should just close these round brackets. That's annoying me. Okay. So the only thing maybe to comment on is property star. Says that we can't get stuck in a state. So in more computer science language, we might say there is no deadlock. Deadlock is when a network, for example, gets into deadlock if everything gets clogged up and nothing can move to another state. So, i.e., there is no deadlock. Now this is a bit restrictive in some ways because, or at least it looks a bit restrictive, because really complex systems might get into states in which there are deadlock and there is no way that the system can move on to another state. So here we are apparently denying ourselves to model such natural systems that may indeed have this property that you can get into states that deadlock. But that's not really the case because we're just giving a mathematical model here. And so if we want to model a system that deadlocks, then what we do is something like the following. So this is just to convince you that there is no real loss of generality. So I just want to remark we can model deadlock. And I'll just give you the idea here. So e.g., so if we were trying to model a system, like this, so just a simple example, and suppose this has property A and property B. We simply add a new atom, D, say, for deadlock. Obviously, doesn't matter what we call the atom, but we should know that it means deadlock. And model so what we do is we add a self loop here from the state to itself, because in order to satisfy this condition star here, we need to have a transition out of this state to some other state, but we flag in the properties that this state enjoys, that is the atoms we have holding at the state, we add the special atom that says this is a deadlock state. So because this is a deadlock state, we don't, when trying to prove properties of the system, we know that if we get here, this corresponds to being stuck in the real world, even though we have a self loop from the state to itself. But because we're flagging this state as deadlocked, we know that this state corresponds to a deadlocked state in the real world. So the point is, so in summary, condition star does not lose us any modelling power. We can still essentially model systems with deadlock, we just have to encode the deadlock in a slightly fussy way. Of course, you might think, well, it would be easier not to have property star and just model deadlock in the natural way, and you would have a very good point if you think that. But that's a perfectly reasonable way to do things. The reason we don't do that is that if we don't have property star, then that complicates the way in which we interpret the linear time temporal logic LTL over transition systems. And that, as we shall see, is already sufficiently complicated as it is, so we don't really want to complicate it any further. So let's actually, in the next part of the lecture, we shall be a little bit relieved that we do have condition star, so that things don't get more complicated than they need to get. Okay, so that's a good pausing point for now. Let's all enjoy a break, and I shall be back again shortly with the second part of the lecture. So bye for now.